Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Fleur. I am the Vice President of Marketing at Veros Real Estate Solutions and Valigent. I'm pleased to welcome all of you who are joining us live today or viewing the recording. If you are joining us live, we will have time at the end of our presentation to take questions. Please go ahead and enter your questions in chat, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end. So today's topic: combating racial bias in the mortgage industry through data, technology, and diversity, is very timely, addressing a very real challenge for our government, lenders, appraisers, and even more significantly, the lives of homeowners potentially impacted by racial bias in the home valuation process. We have a stellar lineup in store for you today. Leading us off, AVM Performance: Is There Evidence of Racial Bias?, with Rina Agarwal and Eric Fox, both economists at Veros. Then Jeff Hogan, Vice President of Valuations, will discuss spotting potential bias in appraisals through keyword identification. And finally, Jeremy McCarthy, CEO and founder of Valigent, will share some of the team's efforts underway to build a more diverse appraiser workforce. Rina, Eric, let's get this webinar rolling.
All right, Brian, thank you very much. Again, my name is Eric Fox, and I'm the Chief Economist here at Veros. And I think there's been a lot of attention recently about alleged incidents of racial bias in the property appraisal process by appraisers. In particular, we've seen stories that have been reported where a minority family receives an appraised value that is low, but when the house is subsequently appraised where minority photos and other items are removed, the house appraises for a higher value. Whether this is intentional or unintentional, systemic or isolated, localized or widespread, that's a subject for debate. Many reports have found differing conclusions, ranging from very serious to minor. No matter which conclusions will ultimately be determined, it's clear, I think, that there are some issues with appraised values by appraisers at some level, but overall uncertainty remains around how widespread or systemic the problems really are. Veros has been one of the leaders with the research and investigation into this topic. Automated valuation models, or AVMs as we sometimes call them, take the human element out of appraised values by seeking out hundreds of comparable properties and thousands of historic sales to determine the best valuation of the subject property. Products like the Vero Value AVM also provide a quantifiable estimate of the accuracy with each estimated valuation. Now, in this presentation and the associated research report, which we released in previous weeks, we're going to be investigating the Vero Value AVM to determine if it exhibits similar issues to some human appraisals, or whether it can be used as a tool to help mitigate these problems due to racial bias. And so to that end, Dr. Rina Agarwal, who is a research economist here at Veros, has studied 5 major metropolitan areas around the US to investigate whether or not evidence of racial bias exists in our AVM. Rina, will you please discuss with us the research methodology you used and the conclusions that you reached?
Sure. Thank you, Eric. Hello and welcome, everyone. So the methodology that we use for testing the presence of racial bias in our AVM, it's pretty simple. We compare AVM predictions or AVM values with the sale price of properties. And we do this by ensuring that the AVM is blind to the sale price. What this means is that we have our AVM provide an estimate of value for the property prior to uploading the sale price into our databases. This means that the AVM does not know the sale price of a property when it provides a valuation for that property. Now that we have our AVM valuations and sale prices, we determine if the AVM value is more or less than the sale price. If the AVM value is less than the sale price, then it is undervaluing that property. If, however, the AVM value is higher than the sale price, then the AVM is overvaluing a property. These differences or errors, that is the difference between AVM values and sale price, are used for our analyses. Specifically, we are interested in undervaluations and overvaluations of 15% or more and 10% or more. These under and overvaluations are commonly known in AVM terminology as P15L, P10L, P15H, and P10H. For example, P15L tells us the percentage of properties in a neighborhood that are undervalued by 15% or more. We test if the direction of these errors is correlated with racial composition. A quick note for you on correlation. Correlation is a statistical measure of how related two variables are. A positive correlation means that if one variable increases, the other also increases. A negative correlation means that if one increases, the other decreases. While P15L and P10L are important from the perspective of undervaluations in minority communities, an analysis of P15H and P10H is also important. Why is that? It is possible that while the AVM does not undervalue properties in minority neighborhoods, it may overvalue properties in majority white neighborhoods. And that is equally of concern from the perspective of racial bias. To test these correlations, we run simple regressions. Now, if you would like to find out more about our methodology, I would like to invite you to read our research report that you can find on the Veros website. Besides undervaluations and overvaluations, another measure that we test is the size of the median absolute errors. From now on, I'll refer to median absolute errors as MAE. So what is MAE? MAE calculates the median differences in absolute terms between AVM values and actual sale prices. For example, an MAE value of 5% means that 50% of the absolute value of errors are greater than 5%, and 50% of the errors are smaller. We wanted to test if our AVM produced larger errors or was more inaccurate in minority communities. To test the accuracy of MAE, we run multiple linear regressions to assess the impact of racial composition of a zip code on MAE, while accounting for other factors such as quality of housing stock and percent of homes sold. By accounting for these effects of these other variables, we can isolate and measure the relationship between the response variable and the predictor variable of interest. And in our case, the variable of interest is the composition of population. Throughout our study, we use zip codes as a proxy for communities or neighborhoods in a city that we analyzed. For each zip code, we determine its racial composition, and data on racial compositions of zip codes is available from ACS, that is the American Community Survey, and this data is provided by the Census Bureau. The reason we use racial compositions of a neighborhood is because we do not know the race of the home sellers or home buyers. So we generalize based on the racial composition of a neighborhood. And we test for racial bias in 5 major cities in the US, namely Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Houston, and Philadelphia. So we started our study with the city of Chicago, given its diverse population. This was in our first report that we published in June. You can see the demographics of Chicago on this slide. We also provided highlights and links from articles, posts, and studies that have cited stats, and also stories about potential racial bias in the city. Now, we won't be going through these quotes and links, but we will be sending out this presentation to all attendees. And if you wish to take a deeper dive into the links, you will have this as a handy resource. Next slide. Coming to the analysis, we find that P15L, that is the proportion of properties that are undervalued by 15% or more, is not correlated with the proportion of Black or Hispanic population in a zip code using the Vero value AVM. What this means is that from the perspective of minority communities, there is no evidence of systemic undervaluation from the Vero value AVM. That is, the AVM does not undervalue a higher percentage of properties as the percentage of minority population increases. We found similar results with respect to P10. The results from our analysis show that a slightly higher percentage of properties were overvalued by the AVM as the proportion of Black population increased, but the percentage of overvalued properties decreased as the percent of white population increased. Again, what this implies is that from the perspective of majority white communities, there is no evidence of systemic overvaluation from the Vero value AVM as the percentage of white population increases. And we found these results to hold true for P10H as well. Again, P10H is the proportion of properties that are overvalued by the AVM by 10% or more. Finally, we analyzed the performance of MAE, that is the median absolute error. The scatter plot shows that the AVM value varies between 1 to 4%, which is a very narrow range. We also examine if the variation in MAE is explained by the racial compositions of communities, or if other variables explain this variation. We find that racial factors are not responsible for the variability in MAE. That is, the AVM is just as accurate in minority neighborhoods as it is in majority white neighborhoods. After our first report, we decided to test the performance of the Vero value AVM in 4 other cities, all ethnically diverse populations. We tested for racial bias in Atlanta, the largest population center in the Deep South, and again, a diverse city. The results with respect to the performance of the AVM showed no evidence of racial bias. Here is an example with P15L, and we find similar results here. I will not go through all the results here, and I would suggest that you read our report for the detailed results. Next, we looked at Los Angeles, the second largest city in the US, again, a diverse population, and again, our results held here. For example, this is a slide showing the result of the P15H, and we see that there is no evidence of racial bias here. Next, we analyzed the performance of our AVM in Philadelphia, another diverse city on the East Coast. Here too, the AVM did not display any evidence of racial bias. We have the results of the performance of P10L here. And these results are again similar to what we see in Chicago and all the other cities. Next, we move to Houston. Now in Houston, the big state of Texas, we see a higher percentage of white population as compared to most of the previous cities we cited. But our results once again showed no evidence of racial bias, as you see in this slide, with respect to the performance of P10H. Now looking at the performance of median absolute errors, this is for Houston, Texas. We see that the median absolute errors were in a narrow range between 1% and 4%, and there is no evidence of racial bias here. There is no evidence that the AVM was less accurate in minority populations. And this result held for all the 5 cities that we have analyzed. This slide is a summary of the results we found in the 5 cities. Overall, we did not find any evidence of racial bias. In no city did we see that our AVM undervalued properties in minority neighborhoods, and neither did we find that our AVM overvalued properties in majority neighborhoods. We conclude that P15L, the proportion of properties that are undervalued by 15% or more is not positively correlated with the proportion of Black and Hispanic populations in a zip code. What this means is P15L does not increase as the proportion of Black or Hispanic populations increase. Hence, the Vero value AVM does not exhibit any systematic undervaluation as minority populations increase. Similarly, P15H, the proportion of properties that are overvalued by 15% or more, is not positively correlated with the percentage of white population. This means that P15H does not increase as the proportion of white population increases. Hence, it does not exhibit overvaluation as the white population increases. We also conclude that the variation in MAE is not significantly explained by the racial compositions of communities. That is, the Vero value AVM is no less accurate in minority communities. In summary, we found no evidence of racial bias in the Vero value AVM.
Thanks for that tremendous insight, Rena and Eric. Now we will hear from Jeff Hogan, the Veros Vice President of Valuations, who will talk to us about the latest in keyword technology and its role in identifying potentially biased words in appraisals. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, Eric and Brian and everyone on the call. Great job, Rena, on that explanation and detail on our AVM. So I'm going to be talking about this issue of biased words in appraisal. It's a hot button issue with all the attention that Eric mentioned earlier that's focused on appraisals and appraisers. It's something that needs to be examined, and it is being examined and looked at. And let me say, first of all, as an appraiser, showing my leaning, I don't know if, or don't want to say that if a person uses certain words in an appraisal, that means they themselves have bias or using that bias in how they do their appraisal or the value conclusion from that appraisal. So we know that there are words that our language is always evolving, right? So we are going from words and terms that we used in society and that we used in appraisal 20, 30 years ago when I started doing appraising that are no longer acceptable today. We're going to talk about some of those words, but it's not to say that there aren't words in appraisals that have the potential to come across as biased, especially in today's environment. And they're words that are outdated and really considered potentially biased by today's standards that could have a negative impression on a particular person of color or minority related to their property value. And I think that because of the stories, because of the articles that have been written, it has brought attention to this. And my belief as an appraiser that the vast majority of appraisers base their value on the conclusion strictly on market data from that subject neighborhood. That's really the job of an appraiser. So even though that's the case, these articles and things have come up. And unfortunately, the reputation in the industry, the appraisal industry, is not very good right now, particularly in minority communities, because of the things of issues of the values not being perceived that it's fairly being across the board as far as how appraisals are being done. So let's get into a couple of definitions and I'll just wrap up what we're doing here. Clearly, there's two types of bias. There's conscious bias and unconscious bias. Conscious bias is what we know is just your attitudes. Everybody has attitudes and thoughts about a certain group or a certain thing. And that's conscious. They know they're being biased. They do it intentionally. So again, as an appraiser, that should have no place in how an appraisal is being done. And it's actually counterproductive to that appraiser. But that being the case, that perception is there. And in some cases, it appears to be true. And it is something like I say, in the minority communities, people I talk to a lot, that is reality. And one of the things we have to do is work on things that are obviously conscious bias. Then there's unconscious bias, which is a little harder to detect because it's implied bias, implicit bias, and it really just based on the attitudes that people have and they based on how they were raised, based on the background, and it operates outside of their awareness and control. And a lot of times, like it says here, they're not even realizing they're doing it. And that's a little harder to do because you're not doing it consciously. In fact, it may even be contradictory to how they really think they believe. And they're applying these conscious bias, whether it's in a neighborhood that they're in, that they're not comfortable with, or a house or a minority group that they're doing the appraisal for, those things unfortunately could possibly have a impact in how they do their appraisal if they're not consciously aware and making sure that they're basing their appraisal on facts and not other things. So let's go to the next slide there. So this is a recent Freddie Mac publication from last month, and they talk about some of the words here that appraisers have used. I've used some of these words, but they could be considered code language for bias. And they use a couple words here highlighted. You may not be able to see it on your screen, but it's in the PowerPoint there. Pride of ownership, crime-ridden area, desirable neighborhood or location, undesirable neighborhood location, gentrified, preferred community, all these different things, diverse, Black community, Hispanic. So all these things that we would use, some appraisers would use to describe a neighborhood, are really irrelevant to the goal, which is to complete the appraisal in an unbiased fashion and to base it on data, regardless of who lives in the home or regardless of the neighborhood. So we're trying to get away from that. So let's go to the next slide. So I talked a little about there's subjective language and objective language, and kind of related to bias and unbiased and non-conscious bias. When you use subjective language, which we all do, it does show our personal preference. It shows the things that we like. You could prefer, I've mentioned I prefer one-story homes versus two-story homes because I don't like going upstairs. I grew up in a house with stairs, don't like stairs. I prefer a one-story home. That's my preference. But when I'm doing an appraisal and how appraisal should be done, we should eliminate preference or things that show our preference if it's not based on market data. So objective language is the opposite of that. It's not based on the individual's point of view. It's unbiased. And basically is just the facts. So I'm presenting the facts about a neighborhood, a property, and I'm not letting my own personal opinion impact how I do that appraisal. So we're trying to, again, do that with language and make sure the language is clear. So let's go to the next slide. So here's some examples of objective language that appraisers should be using to get away from things that are less subject. For example, desirable neighborhood. That's a term that's been used a lot in appraisal. It was a part of when I started appraising, but as you can see, the term desirable can mean different things to different people. So instead of saying desirable neighborhood, an objective description, according to this Fannie Mae update, would be to say list the appraisers. You can list the appraiser's amenities or features that potential buyers would find valuable. For example, you could say an updated neighborhood pool, for example, is in that neighborhood. That's objective and not subjective. A crime-ridden area, very subjective. Instead of saying that, you could say the crime rate in this area is X, which is objective and allows reader to make their own judgment about the potential for the crime. So it goes on, affordable neighborhood, integrated community examples there. One of the things that we're doing at Veros is we have some tools, and there's other tools out there, but we have a tool called Veros Score, which allows the user to identify and find phrases and words that could be code words for bias. And with our partners at VA, we're preparing analytical reports for them and help them work with the context to see if the words that were used in the correct context. And ultimately, the whole point is to make improvements to words and terms and appraisals. These are great tools to help the industry improve. So that led, because of those things, we did have, starting earlier last year, President Biden administration came out with a PAVE council or a task force to evaluate property appraisal and evaluation equity, particularly in minority communities. All the federal agencies and lenders were looked at, and they dug deep into this. I was part of some of these discussions. So one of the things that came from that is that there was a lack of diversity in the industry. You can go to the next slide. So they started the Appraisal Diversity Initiative, which has been going on for a number of years, and it's been part of a lot of companies, a lot of businesses, the Appraisal Institute, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the Appraisal Foundation, a lot of the organizations and banks have sponsored an effort to be intentional about adding diversity to the industry. Go to the next slide. And that was one of the results of the PAVE report, which did some studies on the amount of diversity in the industry right now. So there's some studies show up to 90% or more of appraisers currently in the industry in the United States are white. 70% of those are men, and it's not on here, but the age group is also at the upper end. 50 plus is a typical age for appraisers. So those optics don't look good for the industry. And one of the things they're trying to do to deal with some of these implicit bias issues is have people from these local communities, people of color, minorities, actually in the appraisal industry to kind of help to alleviate at least some of the perception that the industry is predominantly mostly older white men. There it is, the average age is 72, 52 years old, and the turn time that it typically takes is there. And there's a lack of people coming into the industry. The ages is high, and there are barriers to entry that not only are there not a lot of minorities, but there's also not a lot of youth. So there's a limited number of appraisers, causing fees to go up. And some of the regulation has made it tough, including one of the toughest ones is the experience requirement. So even once you get the classes and get your education, you still need to be under a supervisor. And so there are appraisers out there right now in the industry that are available to be trained, but don't have a supervisor. So that leads me to the next slide, which is dealing with how we, working with our partner Valigent, Jeremy McCarty is going to explain how we are helping with that one piece, that series piece where you have trainees that are not available to find, that don't have supervisors to help them complete their training requirement to become licensed appraisers.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that preliminary discussion. And just to go over what we're doing as far as appraiser training to address the lack of diversity in the appraisal profession, we've developed a comprehensive appraiser training program. In addition to the appraisal courses prospective trainee must take to obtain a trainee's license, we've created a full curriculum of educational materials and training modules that provide practical applications to the real world of appraising. Each trainee is matched with the certified appraiser supervisor who is responsible for the entire 6-month period of training required for the trainee to obtain their full appraisal license. The supervisor will provide training on the inspection process, data sources, comparable selection, value analysis, essentially every aspect of the appraisal. The supervisor will sign every appraisal report completed by the trainee, accepting full responsibility for the contents of the entire report. Our 2023 goal is to train 100 new diverse appraisers. We have a monthly meeting with Fannie Mae to track the progression of the 400 plus appraisal diversity initiative scholarship winners to match with our available supervisors as they complete their required preliminary education. Both trainees and trainers are hired as Valigent employees with full benefits. The training includes the latest inspection technology, data integrations, and market analytics, so the trainee is fully equipped to excel in the current and future appraisal profession. Next slide. Although we have invested significantly in the appraisal diversity, we need the help of lenders to make a real difference in the status quo. We are not asking for a contribution of money or time, just a willingness to direct a few current appraisal orders to a trainee supervisor team. All that is needed to support one diverse trainee is 30 appraisal orders per month within a certain geography. The appraisals will be completed within a few days at standard fees, signed and full responsibility taken by the certified appraiser supervisor. We look forward to working with any interested parties that would like to further their commitment to diversity in their organization and the communities that they serve.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks everyone for the excellent insight you were able to share today. So the questions have been flowing in. So now let's get as many of these answered as possible. What we don't get to on this call, we will send out a Q&A recap in the coming days. So let's see what we have here.